There's a certain kind of silence in places people shouldn't linger. Not the peaceful quiet of the woods, but a stifling stillness like even the wind is afraid to move. I noticed it as soon as we stepped out of the car. The trees around us stood still, no birds, no rustling leaves, just the kind of silence that felt wrong. "Are you sure about this?" I asked, watching as Megan, my girlfriend, pulled her backpack from the trunk with unsettling eagerness. She didn't even glance my way. "We agreed, didn't we?" she said, her voice sharper than I remembered. I hadn't really agreed, more like nodded absent-mindedly when she first brought up this crazy idea. Megan was always drawn to strange things: tarot cards, conspiracy theories, and now this. A rundown cabin in the middle of nowhere, supposedly hiding something ancient and forbidden. It sounded absurd, but something about her eyes made it hard to say no. The cabin was worse than I'd imagined: boards creaking underfoot, windows long shattered, yet it remained strangely intact, like the forest itself had given up trying to reclaim it. The moment Megan pushed open the door, a weight settled in my chest. The air inside was thick, almost suffocating, and my nerves screamed at me to turn around. But Megan wasn't scared. She was different, more focused, as if something was driving her. I watched in growing unease as she set candles in a perfect circle on the dusty floor, her hands moving with practiced precision. "What's with the candles?" I asked, my voice sounding loud in the heavy silence. Megan smiled faintly, her face illuminated by the flickering light. "We're doing something real tonight, something that will change everything." She reached into her bag and pulled out a book, old, with a cracked leather cover that looked as if it would crumble under the slightest touch. I felt an unnatural chill crawl up my spine as she handed it to me. "What's this?" I asked, staring at the strange symbols etched on the cover. "The Necronomicon," she whispered, her voice reverent. "Open it." I hesitated. There was something wrong about this. Everything in my gut told me to leave it alone. But as usual, I couldn't say no to her. Reluctantly, I flipped through the pages, but the strange symbols swam before my eyes, impossible to understand. "I can't read this," I muttered, closing the book quickly. "Not yet," she replied, her eyes gleaming, "but you will." Suddenly, the air in the cabin thickened, pressing down on me as the shadows around us seemed to pulse with every flicker of candlelight. Megan knelt in the center of the circle and began to chant, the words foreign, yet eerily familiar, as though they were pulling at something deep inside me. "Megan, stop," I said, stepping back as an unbearable pressure filled the room. But she didn't stop. Her chanting grew louder, more urgent, and the ground beneath us began to tremble. That's when I saw it, a crack in the floor, slowly widening as something dark and shifting pushed its way up from below. A sickening stench filled the room as tendrils of shadow began to reach out from the growing rift, curling and stretching toward the ceiling. "Megan, we have to go," I shouted, but she didn't move. She was transfixed, staring at the thing in the floor with a wild hunger in her eyes. Then one of the tendrils shot forward, wrapping around her leg. She gasped, but didn't scream. Instead, she smiled. "It's here," she whispered. "It's real." I lunged forward, grabbing her arm and pulling with all my strength. The force was overwhelming, like trying to pull her out of quicksand. But somehow, I managed to yank her free, and we both crashed to the floor as the crack in the ground sealed itself shut, the tendrils vanishing into the darkness. For a moment, everything was still. My heart was pounding in my ears, but Megan just laughed a soft, unsettling sound. "Did you see that?" she said, her eyes wide with excitement. "It worked." I stared at her, horrified. "Megan, we almost died. We need to leave." She shook her head, her smile growing. "Leave? We just started. There's so much more waiting for us down there." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Something had changed in her. The woman I knew was gone, replaced by something driven by a dangerous obsession. She moved toward the far wall, running her hands over the stones until she found a hidden door, revealing a narrow staircase leading into the earth. "Come on," she said, stepping into the darkness below. "Let's see what's waiting for us." Against every instinct, I followed her, into the shadows, into the unknown. The tunnels beneath the cabin stretched out like the veins of some ancient beast, twisting deeper into the earth. Symbols, like those in the book, were etched into the stone walls, pulsing faintly with a life of their own. As we descended further, the air grew colder, more oppressive, as though the very ground was breathing, waiting. At the bottom of the stairs, a massive chamber opened before us, lined with ruins far older than the cabin above. Megan's eyes glinted in the candlelight, her grin widening as we stepped into the heart of the darkness. "We're not leaving," she whispered, "not until we see what lies beneath." And in that moment, I realized there was no going back. Megan's words echoed in the cold chamber, bouncing off the stone walls like a taunt. I wanted to yell at her, shake her, anything to snap her out of whatever trance had overtaken her, but she was too far gone. The excitement that radiated from her was more than just a thrill. It was something darker, more primal, like an obsession that had finally found its reward. I hesitated at the entrance to one of the tunnels, feeling the cool, damp air drift up from the darkness below. It smelled of earth, decay, and something metallic. Blood, perhaps? I wasn't sure, but every instinct screamed for me to turn around. This place didn't belong to us. We had no right to be here. Yet, Megan moved forward, like a moth drawn to the flame, compelled by forces I couldn't see. "Megan, stop," I shouted, my voice trembling. She didn't even flinch. I could barely see her now, just the faint glow of her candle bobbing as she disappeared into the tunnel's narrow mouth. I swallowed hard, cursing under my breath. There was no turning back, not without her. Gripping my flashlight, I took a deep breath and plunged into the darkness after her. The tunnel walls felt alive, breathing almost, as though they were watching us. Symbols, much like the ones in the Necronomicon, lined every inch of the stone, their meanings lost to time, but their intent unmistakable. These were not marks of worship, they were warnings. Something had been buried here, deep beneath the earth, and we had been foolish enough to wake it. The deeper I went, the more oppressive the air became. My chest tightened, my breath shallow. The only sound was the echo of my footsteps, and Megan's in the distance, the rhythmic beat of our movement almost in sync with the pulsing energy I could feel beneath my feet. "Don't you feel it?" Megan's voice drifted back to me, eerily calm. "This place is alive, waiting for us. This is what the book was leading to all along." I caught up to her at a sudden drop in the tunnel, where the ground gave way to a large underground chasm. The space beyond was immense, an ancient cavern that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. In the center, illuminated by the dim light of our candles, was something that made my blood run cold. A stone altar, draped in age-old moss, standing tall in the middle of the room, and on it, a shape, a figure, wrapped in cloth so decayed it barely clung to the bones beneath it. But it wasn't the figure itself that terrified me. It was the unmistakable hum of something wrong that emanated from it. A presence ancient and hungry that we had disturbed. "We shouldn't be here," I whispered, backing away from the altar. Every fiber of my being wanted to flee. Megan, however, was entranced. She stepped toward the altar, her eyes wide with wonder. "Don't you see? This is it. This is what the book was talking about. We found it. We found them." "Found who?" I asked, fear twisting in my gut. She didn't answer. Instead, she reached into her backpack and pulled out the Necronomicon again, flipping through its pages with a reverence that made me sick. The words she began to chant were low, almost a whisper, but the effect was immediate. The air around us thickened, pressing down as if the cavern itself were waking up. "Megan, stop!" I shouted, running toward her. But before I could reach her, the figure on the altar moved. The bones shifted under the rotting cloth, a grotesque shudder that sent a jolt of terror through me. Its hand bony, skeletal reached out and touched the air, as though it could sense Megan's presence, or maybe mine. The ground beneath us rumbled once more, and this time, it didn't stop. The entire cavern seemed to shake, and cracks splintered across the floor. From the altar, a deep, guttural moan escaped the figure's mouth, a sound that had no business coming from something so dead. I grabbed Megan's arm, yanking her back, We have to go, now." She struggled against me, her eyes wide and frantic. "No, we're so close, don't you see? This is what we've been looking for. This is power, real power." Her words were cut off by another moan, this one louder, angrier. The figure was rising now, sitting up on the altar as the ancient wrappings fell away, revealing the decayed face beneath. Its empty eye sockets turned toward us, and for a moment, I swear I saw something alive flickering within them. I didn't wait for it to move again. Dragging Megan behind me, I bolted for the tunnel. The ground was cracking faster now, pieces of stone falling from the ceiling as the entire cavern threatened to collapse. The air was filled with dust and the echo of that terrible moaning, growing louder with every step. We barely made it into the tunnel before the floor behind us gave way, the chasm swallowing the altar and whatever was on it whole. The rumbling continued, and I could hear the sound of something pursuing us in the darkness, something ancient and furious, woken from a slumber it should have never been disturbed from. Megan struggled in my grip, trying to go back, but I wasn't about to let her. Whatever madness had taken hold of her would kill us both if I let her return. "No," she screamed, "we can't leave. It's not over yet." "Yes, it is," I shouted, dragging her toward the exit. The tunnel walls seemed to close in on us, the weight of centuries pressing down. But I didn't stop, not until I saw the faint light of the cabin's entrance ahead. With one final burst of adrenaline, we burst out of the tunnel and into the clearing outside, just as the ground below us gave one final shudder and collapsed into the earth. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. The trees stood still, the air unmoving. It was as though the land itself was catching its breath after what had just happened. But Megan, she wasn't done. As I released her, she fell to her knees, staring at the ground where the tunnel had once been, her face twisted in disbelief. "It's gone," she whispered. "The power, it's gone." I knelt beside her, my hands shaking. "No, Megan, we're gone. We're leaving, and we're never coming back." She looked at me then, something dark still lurking in her eyes, a hunger that hadn't been fully satisfied. "You don't understand. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning," and somehow I knew she was right. For days after our escape, the ground seemed to tremble beneath my feet, like an unshakable reminder of what we had disturbed. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the figure on the altar, its decayed hand reaching out, the terrible moaning that still echoed in my mind. I should have been grateful we made it out alive, but something gnawed at me, a creeping feeling that we hadn't escaped at all. Megan was worse. She'd barely spoken since we returned to the cabin. She stayed locked in her room, poring over the Necronomicon like it was some kind of holy relic. I tried reasoning with her, begging her to destroy it, but nothing reached her. She had become obsessed, her mind tethered to the power she believed she had uncovered. Her eyes were hollow now, consumed by the same darkness that seemed to linger in the corners of every room we entered. I started noticing strange things around the cabin. Doors left open that I was sure I had closed, shadows moving out of the corner of my eye, whispers in the night that made my skin crawl. At first, I convinced myself it was just paranoia after everything we'd been through. My mind was playing tricks on me. But then, Megan started talking in her sleep. It wasn't the usual murmurs or restless movements. She spoke in a language I didn't recognize, guttural, ancient, the same twisted words she had chanted in the cavern. Every night it got worse. I would stand outside her door, listening as her voice grew louder, more insistent, like she was answering something, or worse, calling to it. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I burst into her room, ready to shake her awake, to snap her out of whatever madness had taken hold. But what I saw stopped me cold. She was sitting upright in bed, her eyes wide open, but completely blank, staring straight ahead. Her mouth moved rapidly, whispering those awful, indecipherable words. The Necronomicon lay open on her lap, its pages glowing faintly in the dark, as though the book itself was alive. "Megan," I whispered, my voice trembling. She didn't respond. Her body was stiff, her lips still moving as if under someone else's control. The temperature in the room had dropped drastically, and I could see my breath hanging in the air. I reached out, my hand shaking, and touched her shoulder. Her skin was ice cold. Suddenly, her head snapped toward me, her eyes locking onto mine, but they weren't her eyes anymore. The whites were gone, replaced by an inky blackness that seemed to swallow all the light in the room. "You shouldn't have interfered," she said, her voice low and guttural, nothing like the Megan I knew. It was deeper, more menacing, as if something else was speaking through her. I stumbled back, heart pounding in my chest. "Megan, please, Megan is gone," the voice snarled. "You should have left her in the cavern, but now it's too late." Her body jerked violently, and she collapsed onto the bed, the book falling to the floor with a dull thud. I rushed to her side, shaking her gently. "Megan, Megan, wake up," she stirred, her eyes fluttering open, back to normal. But the look of confusion and terror on her face told me she had no idea what had just happened. "What's going on?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Why are you in my room?" I stared at her, unsure of how to explain the darkness that had taken root inside her. "You were talking in your sleep," I said slowly, trying to keep my voice steady. Something was wrong. She looked at me, bewildered, before glancing down at the Necronomicon on the floor. Her expression shifted, something flickered in her eyes, something hungry. "I need to get rid of it," I said, picking up the book. "No," Megan's voice was sharp, her hand shooting out to grab my wrist. "Don't, we're so close." "Close to what?" I snapped. "Look at yourself, Megan. This book is destroying you." Her grip tightened, and for a moment, I saw the same darkness flicker behind her eyes again. "You don't understand. The power, it's real. I've seen it. We can control it." I yanked my arm free, my heart racing. "Megan, you're scaring me. This isn't you." She stared at me for a long moment, her expression softening. "I'm sorry," she whispered. I just need time to figure it out. I promise, I'm fine." But she wasn't fine. None of this was fine. I left the room, taking the Necronomicon with me, determined to end this nightmare once and for all. I didn't care if Megan hated me for it. I didn't care if she never spoke to me again. I had to destroy the book before it consumed her completely. But as I stood outside, holding the book over the fire pit, I hesitated. The pages seemed to pulse beneath my fingers, as though it was alive, aware of what I was about to do. The symbols etched into the leather cover glowed faintly, and a voice, barely a whisper, echoed in the back of my mind. "You can't stop it." I clenched my teeth, shaking my head. "Watch me," I muttered, tossing the book into the flames. For a moment, nothing happened. The fire crackled, licking at the edges of the book, but it didn't burn. It didn't even catch, and then the flames exploded. A gust of wind tore through the yard, knocking me to the ground as the fire roared to life, growing higher, wilder. The Necronomicon hovered above the flames, untouched, as if the fire itself was rejecting it. I scrambled back, watching in horror as the book slowly drifted out of the fire pit, floating toward the cabin, toward Megan. I ran after it, panic rising in my chest, but by the time I reached the door, it was too late. Megan was standing in the doorway, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe as the book hovered before her, glowing with a dark, unnatural light. "I told you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's not over." The ground beneath us rumbled again, just like it had in the cavern. The air grew thick with the same oppressive energy, and I knew deep down, I knew that whatever we had woken in that underground chamber wasn't done with us. "Megan, please," but she wasn't listening anymore. She reached out, her hand trembling as she touched the Necronomicon, and the moment her fingers made contact, the world seemed to shift. The darkness that had been lingering at the edges of our lives crashed down around us, and I realized, with a sickening certainty, that this was never about the book. It was about us. And now there was no escape. Days passed, and the world outside our cabin seemed to shift in subtle, insidious ways. It wasn't just in Megan's behavior, though she grew more distant, more enthralled by the Necronomicon. The air itself felt heavier, oppressive. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of leaves outside, felt like the harbinger of something sinister, something ancient that was watching, waiting. I'd lost count of how many nights I spent lying awake, my mind buzzing with fear and paranoia. The whispers from Megan's room were constant now, growing louder with each passing day. Sometimes I could hear them even when I was outside, walking in the woods, far from the cabin. It was like the very earth had taken up her strange chant, the words vibrating through the ground, through the trees, through me. Megan hardly spoke to me anymore, but when she did, it was never the Megan I once knew. Her voice was distant, like someone speaking through a veil of fog, her eyes always glinting with that eerie, blackened void. I couldn't reach her. I didn't know if there was anything left of her to save. I tried calling for help, friends, family, even the authorities, but every time, the calls wouldn't connect. The signal bars on my phone had disappeared completely, and even the landline in the cabin was dead, as though we were cut off from the rest of the world. I had no choice but to stay, to figure out some way to save Megan and end this nightmare. One night, as I sat in the living room, staring out into the darkness, I heard something new, a soft knock at the front door. My heart lurched into my throat. No one should have been out there. Not at this time of night, not in this remote part of the woods. And yet, there it was, another knock, slow and deliberate, as if whoever was on the other side knew I was hesitating. I stood, every muscle in my body screaming at me to run, but my feet moved toward the door on their own. As I reached for the handle, the knocking stopped. Silence fell over the cabin, thick and suffocating. I opened the door a crack, peering into the blackness outside. Nothing. Just the endless expanse of the night, the trees swaying slightly in the wind. And then I saw a figure standing at the edge of the tree line, just beyond the reach of the porch light. At first, I thought it might be a trick of the shadows, but as I squinted, I realized it was real. A man, or at least something that looked like one. His form was tall and thin, draped in tattered robes that seemed to blend into the darkness around him. His face was obscured by a hood, but I could feel his eyes on me, watching. I slammed the door shut, my heart racing. Whoever or whatever that was, it wasn't human. I locked the door, backing away, trying to steady my breathing, but then the knocking started again. This time, it wasn't on the door, it was coming from inside the walls. I turned slowly, dread curling in my stomach as the sound echoed through the cabin, louder and more insistent. It seemed to come from every direction, above, below, around me. I pressed my hands to my ears, but it did nothing to block out the noise. "Megan," I shouted, running down the hall to her room. "Megan, we need to leave, now." I burst through the door, expecting to find her in the same trance-like state as before, but she wasn't on the bed. The room was empty, save for the Necronomicon, which lay open on the floor, glowing with that sickly green light. "Megan," I whispered, my voice trembling. The knocking grew louder, the sound now morphing into a rhythmic pounding, like a heartbeat reverberating through the walls. And then, amidst the noise, I heard a voice, low and raspy, speaking in that same ancient language Megan had been chanting. I backed away slowly, my eyes darting around the room. The shadows seemed to move on their own now, stretching and writhing like they were alive. And then I saw her. Megan was standing in the corner, her back to me, her body rigid. She was muttering under her breath, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "Megan," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "We need to leave. Please, we have to go now." She didn't respond. I took a cautious step toward her, my heart pounding in my chest. "Megan, please." Suddenly, she turned around, her eyes wide and filled with terror. "It's here," she whispered. "It's inside me." Before I could respond, her body convulsed violently, and she let out a scream, an agonizing, blood-curdling scream that echoed through the cabin. The air around her seemed to warp, like heat waves rising off the pavement. Her skin began to pale, her veins darkening as they pulsed beneath the surface, as though something was moving inside her. "Megan," I shouted, reaching for her, but she recoiled, her face twisted in pain. "No," she gasped, clutching her chest. "You don't understand. It's too late. I can't stop it." I could see the fear in her eyes, but beneath it, something else, something far darker. Her pupils had begun to dilate, the inky blackness from before consuming the whites of her eyes again. She was slipping away, losing control. Suddenly, the pounding stopped. The air grew still, unnaturally so, like the calm before a storm. And then I heard it. A voice deep, guttural, and ancient, booming from the shadows. The time has come. The floor beneath us trembled, cracks splintering across the wood. The temperature dropped even further, the air around us thick with a malevolent energy. I could feel it in my bones. Something was coming, something terrible. "Megan, we need to leave," I said, my voice barely steady. "Please, we have to go now." But she shook her head slowly, her eyes filled with a strange calm. "It's too late," she whispered. "I can feel it. It's already here." Before I could say anything else, the ground beneath Megan gave way, splitting open with a deafening crack. She let out a cry as she was swallowed by the earth, her body disappearing into the dark abyss below. "Megan," I screamed, lunging forward, but I was too late. The floor closed up, sealing her fate. All that remained was the Necronomicon, lying at my feet, glowing with that same unholy light. I dropped to my knees, staring in disbelief at the spot where she had been. She was gone, swallowed by the very darkness we had unleashed. And then, from the shadows, the figure appeared again, the same one I had seen outside. It stood at the edge of the room, watching me, its hooded face still obscured. But this time, I could feel its presence more strongly, its power radiating through the air like a suffocating weight. "It is done," the voice said, cold and final. I didn't have the strength to move. I just knelt there, staring at the book, the reality of what had happened sinking in. We had played with forces far beyond our understanding, and now Megan was lost, consumed by the darkness, and I was next. I don't remember how long I knelt there, frozen, the crushing silence swallowing me whole. Every part of me was screaming to get up, to run, to flee from the cabin, from the woods, from the night itself. But I couldn't. My legs were numb, my hands trembling as they hovered above the Necronomicon, which still pulsed with that sickly, greenish glow. The hooded figure loomed over me, silent now, but I could feel its presence weighing down on me like the thick, oppressive air before a storm. Its form shifted slightly in the dim light, as if the shadows were part of it, flowing and melding into its very being. I couldn't make out a face beneath the hood, just an endless void that seemed to pull at me, beckoning. And then, without a word, it moved. The figure glided toward me, slow and deliberate, its feet never touching the ground. My instinct screamed for me to get up, to fight, to do something, but my body refused to obey. I was paralyzed, as if trapped in a nightmare where my limbs were weighed down by lead. The figure stopped just a few feet away, towering over me, and for the first time, I could feel something other than terror, a strange, almost magnetic pull. There was a power in this thing, an ancient, unknowable force that seemed to thrumming in the air, calling to me. I could hear it whispering in the back of my mind, speaking a language I couldn't understand, but that resonated deep in my bones. "You are the last," it said, the voice a low, guttural rumble that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "It is not finished." A chill ran down my spine, but I forced myself to speak. What do you want?" The figure didn't answer immediately. Instead, it extended a hand, if you could call it that. Its arm was elongated, its fingers impossibly long and bony, the skin gray and cracked like old parchment. As it reached for me, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, a certainty that if it touched me, it would be the end. But before its fingers could brush my skin, the Necronomicon reacted. The book flared with an intense burst of green light, so bright it blinded me for a moment. The figure recoiled, a guttural growl escaping its shadowy form as it stepped back, retreating into the far corner of the room. I gasped, blinking away the spots in my vision, and when I looked again, the figure was gone. For a moment, I just stared at the book in disbelief. It had saved me. Somehow, the very thing that had brought this nightmare upon us had kept the darkness at bay. But why, and for how long? I knew I couldn't stay here. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't done with me yet, and the cabin, this place that had once been a refuge, was no longer safe. I grabbed the Necronomicon, its pages still warm to the touch, and stuffed it into my backpack. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely zip it closed, but I managed to pull myself to my feet, my legs wobbling beneath me. I had to leave. Now, the night outside was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that feels unnatural, as though the world is holding its breath. The wind had stilled, and even the ever-present rustling of leaves had ceased, leaving only the oppressive weight of the dark woods pressing in around me. I stumbled through the underbrush, branches snagging at my clothes and scratching my skin as I ran, but I didn't care. I had to get as far away from the cabin as possible, had to put distance between myself and whatever dark force was lurking there. The trees seemed to close in on me, their shadows stretching and twisting in the moonlight, but I forced myself to keep going, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't know where I was going, just that I had to move. The woods felt wrong, like they were warping and shifting around me, but I pushed forward, desperate to find some semblance of safety. But no matter how far I ran, the presence lingered, like a cold hand gripping the back of my neck. And then the whispers started again. At first, they were faint, barely audible over the sound of my own labored breathing. But soon they grew louder, more insistent, until they were echoing through the trees, surrounding me. "It's not finished, you are the last." The words clawed at my mind, filling me with a cold, creeping dread. I could feel the presence closing in, the air growing thick and heavy with malevolence. I stumbled, nearly falling as I tripped over a tree root, but I caught myself and kept going, heart pounding in my chest. But no matter how far I ran, the whispers followed, relentless. It wasn't long before I found myself standing at the edge of a clearing, a wide, open space in the middle of the forest. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie, pale light over the scene, and in the center of the clearing stood an ancient stone altar, its surface worn smooth by time. I didn't want to approach it, but some unseen force was drawing me in, pulling me toward the altar. My legs moved on their own, each step heavy and reluctant as I crossed the clearing. The air here was different, charged with an almost electric energy that hummed through the ground, through the trees, through me. When I reached the altar, I stopped, staring down at its cold, stone surface. It was covered in strange markings, symbols I recognized from the Necronomicon, though I still couldn't decipher their meaning. And then, as if compelled by some invisible hand, I opened my backpack and pulled out the book. The moment the Necronomicon touched the altar, the ground beneath my feet trembled. The symbols on the stone began to glow with that same sickly green light, pulsing in time with the beating of my heart. The air grew colder, the whispers now a cacophony of voices swirling around me. The time has come. The words echoed in my mind as I opened the book, its pages flipping on their own, stopping at the passage Megan had been reading. The text glowed, and before I could stop myself, I began to read aloud, the ancient language spilling from my lips in a voice that wasn't my own. As I spoke, the wind picked up, whipping through the trees, and the ground shook violently. The green light from the altar intensified, spreading outwards in a wave of energy that rippled through the clearing. I could feel it, the darkness awakening, rising from the earth, drawn by the power of the ritual. And then, from the shadows, the figure appeared once more, but this time it wasn't alone. The hooded figure stood at the edge of the clearing, flanked by countless others, tall, gaunt figures draped in tattered robes, their faces obscured by darkness. They stood in a circle, watching, waiting. The final words of the incantation slipped from my lips, and the world seemed to hold its breath. The ground split open beneath the altar, a jagged crack forming in the earth as a cold, unnatural wind surged from below. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the green light from the Necronomicon blazed brighter than ever, casting long, twisted shadows across the clearing. Something was coming. Something ancient, something malevolent, and then I saw it. From the depths of the earth, a figure began to rise, a monstrous, grotesque thing, its form shifting and writhing as it emerged from the darkness. Its body was twisted and contorted, an abomination of limbs and eyes and teeth, its skin slick and glistening in the moonlight. The ground shook with its arrival, the trees bending and groaning under the weight of its presence. The hooded figures bowed as the creature rose, their voices joining in a low, droning chant that reverberated through the clearing. I stood frozen, the Necronomicon still clutched in my hands, as the creature turned its many eyes toward me. It was here, and there was no escape. As the creature loomed above me, its countless eyes staring into my soul, a single, terrible realization struck me. Megan hadn't been the target. She had been a vessel, a conduit for this ancient, malevolent force. I was the target. I was the one it had been waiting for. I was the one it had been drawing in, step by step, moment by moment, ever since I had opened that cursed book. Megan was simply a casualty, a sacrifice to bring me here, to this moment. The creature let out a low, rumbling growl, and I knew what was coming. There was no escape, no way to undo what had been done. The darkness had won. And as the creature descended upon me, the last thing I saw was the Necronomicon, its pages still glowing, the ancient words etched into my mind. It was finished. The forest was still, not a single leaf stirred. The wind that had once howled through the trees had vanished, leaving behind an unnatural calm that settled over the clearing like a shroud. The moon hung low in the sky, its pale light casting eerie shadows over the ancient altar, now cracked and crumbling. There was no sign of the monstrous creature, no sign of the hooded figures. It was as if the earth itself had swallowed them whole, erasing any trace of their presence. But the Necronomicon remained. The cursed book lay on the altar, its pages now dark and lifeless, the green light that had pulsed from its core extinguished. The ancient symbols that had once glowed with dark power were now nothing more than faded markings, barely visible in the dim light. And in the center of the clearing, where the protagonist had stood, there was only silence. For a moment, it seemed as though the world had forgotten the terror that had unfolded here, the unspeakable horrors that had been unleashed from the depths of the earth. But beneath the surface, something still lingered. Something ancient and malevolent, waiting for its next chance to rise. The local authorities found the cabin abandoned. The once cozy refuge had been reduced to a derelict shell, its windows shattered, the walls covered in strange, indecipherable markings. The investigation turned up nothing unusual, no bodies, no signs of struggle, just the eerie sense that something terrible had happened here, something they couldn't explain. They didn't find the Necronomicon. In fact, none of the investigators seemed to know about the book at all. It had simply vanished, as if it had never existed in the first place. But for those who had stumbled upon the scene, the strange, oppressive atmosphere that lingered around the cabin was undeniable. Whispers began to spread among the townsfolk, rumors of dark rituals, of ancient forces best left undisturbed. Some said the cabin was cursed, that anyone who went near it would be haunted by strange dreams and eerie visions. Others believed the land itself was tainted, that something evil had been awakened in the woods that night. Whatever the truth was, one thing was certain: no one dared to venture into those woods again. A few weeks later, deep in the night, a figure appeared at the edge of the forest. A man, gaunt and weary, his clothes torn and dirty, his eyes hollow. His steps were slow, deliberate, as if he was being pulled toward the cabin by some unseen force. It was the protagonist. He had survived. Somehow, against all odds, he had escaped the ritual, escaped the creature's grasp. But he wasn't the same. There was something different about him now, something dark. His eyes, once filled with fear and desperation, now held a strange, cold detachment, as if he had seen things no human mind could comprehend. The Necronomicon had taken him body, soul, and mind. He didn't speak as he approached the cabin, didn't react to the eerie silence that hung over the clearing. Instead, he walked straight to the altar where the book had once lain and knelt before it. The air was still, the moonlight casting long shadows across the ground. And then, without a word, he pulled something from his tattered coat, a book. Old, leather-bound, its cover cracked and worn, the Necronomicon. He opened the book, his fingers tracing the ancient symbols with a strange familiarity. The pages glowed faintly, pulsing with that sickly green light, and the air around him seemed to grow colder, heavier. He began to speak. The words flowed from his lips in a low, guttural whisper, the same ancient language he had read during the ritual. But this time, there was no fear, no hesitation. The words came easily, naturally, as if he had always known them. And as he spoke, the ground began to tremble, the clearing filled with the low, ominous hum of energy building beneath the earth. The trees groaned and creaked, their branches swaying in the still air, and the moonlight flickered as dark clouds rolled across the sky. He was bringing it back. The ancient force had not been defeated. It had merely been waiting, biding its time, watching through the eyes of the one it had chosen. The protagonist had been marked from the moment he opened the Necronomicon, his fate sealed by forces beyond his understanding. He had escaped the creature that night, but it had left its mark on him. And now he was no longer just a man, he was a vessel, a conduit for the dark power that had slumbered beneath the earth for millennia. As the ritual reached its climax, the ground split open once more, and from the depths, the monstrous creature began to rise again. Its many eyes glowed in the darkness, its grotesque form shifting and writhing as it emerged from the shadows. The protagonist didn't flinch, didn't move as the creature loomed over him, its cold, twisted gaze fixed on him. He simply stood there, silent, as the dark power surged through him, consuming him from the inside out. The last thing he saw was the creature's eyes, glowing with ancient malevolence. And then, there was nothing. In the years that followed, the cabin became nothing more than a forgotten relic, buried deep in the woods, its dark history lost to time. But for those who ventured too close, there was always a sense of something watching, waiting. The whispers never stopped, and the Necronomicon, its dark pages filled with ancient, forbidden knowledge, was still out there, waiting for the next soul to stumble upon its cursed words. For those who sought power, for those who craved knowledge, the temptation was always there, and the darkness was always hungry. The legend of the Necronomicon lived on, whispered among those brave or foolish enough to seek the truth. People said the book was cursed, that its ancient pages were filled with a darkness too deep for the human mind to fathom. The cabin, once a place of refuge, had become a ghostly relic, avoided by locals who still claimed to hear whispers in the wind, the sound of pages turning in the dead of night. But the story didn't end there. Years later, a group of amateur ghost hunters, eager to make a name for themselves, ventured into the woods, armed with cameras, recorders, and a thirst for the supernatural. They were skeptical, laughing nervously as they approached the overgrown path that led to the forgotten cabin. As they crossed into the clearing, the air grew thick, heavy with the weight of 1,000 unspoken secrets. The trees loomed over them like silent sentinels, their twisted branches forming grotesque shapes in the pale moonlight. The group's laughter faded, replaced by an eerie silence as they laid eyes on the cabin. It was exactly as the legends described, broken, abandoned, covered in ancient markings. The door creaked on its hinges as one of the hunters pushed it open, revealing the dark, empty interior. Dust and decay filled the air, and the floorboards groaned underfoot. "Let's set up here," one of them said, though his voice betrayed his growing unease. They filmed their exploration, setting up cameras in every corner, hoping to catch anything that might confirm the stories they had heard. As the night wore on, they conducted interviews, shared ghost stories, and nervously joked about the cabin's reputation. But none of them knew the true terror that lay beneath. As the clock struck midnight, the temperature in the cabin plummeted. The air grew colder, biting at their skin even through layers of clothing. The wind outside howled, rattling the fragile walls, and somewhere in the distance, they heard the faintest sound, a deep, resonant hum, like the earth itself groaning in protest. And then the lights went out. Panic spread through the group as they scrambled for their flashlights, their laughter now replaced by fear. The darkness pressed in from all sides, thick and suffocating. Shadows seemed to shift and move, even though no one was near them. One of the hunters, a young man named Mark, was the first to hear the faint rustling of pages. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, his flashlight shaking as he swept it around the room. The others paused, straining their ears. At first, It was barely audible, but then it grew louder, more distinct. The unmistakable sound of pages turning, slowly, deliberately, coming from somewhere deep within the cabin. They followed the sound, their footsteps hesitant as they ventured into a small room at the back of the cabin. And there, lying on a decaying wooden table, was the book, the Necronomicon. Its cover was cracked and worn, just as the legends described, but the pages seemed to glow faintly, as though they held an energy of their own. Mark, drawn by a force he couldn't explain, reached out to touch it. "Don't," one of the others warned, but it was too late. As his fingers brushed the ancient leather, the room erupted in a blinding flash of green light. The walls shook, the ground trembled, and a terrible, guttural sound filled the air, the same monstrous growl that had echoed through the woods so many years ago. The creature had returned. Screams filled the cabin as the hunters tried to flee, but the door slammed shut with a deafening bang, trapping them inside. The Necronomicon flipped open on its own, the pages turning rapidly, and the green light intensified, casting grotesque shadows on the walls. One by one, they fell. The creature emerged from the darkness, its many eyes glowing with malevolent glee as it claimed its victims. Mark was the last to fall, his body writhing in agony as the dark power consumed him, just as it had consumed the protagonist all those years ago. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the terror ended. The cabin was silent once more. The Necronomicon closed itself, its pages now dark and still. The creature vanished into the shadows, leaving behind only the bodies of the hunters, their faces frozen in expressions of unspeakable horror. The book had claimed them, just as it had claimed so many before, but it wasn't finished, not yet. Days later, the authorities discovered the scene, baffled by the carnage. There were no signs of forced entry, no explanation for the mysterious deaths. The media called it a tragic accident, an unsolved mystery, but those who knew the truth whispered of the book, the Necronomicon. It had been there, watching, waiting, feeding on the fear and desperation of those who sought it out. And it would continue to wait, hidden in the shadows, until the next soul stumbled upon its cursed pages. The cycle would begin again, because darkness never truly sleeps. And the Necronomicon. It never forgets.